It's a pleasure to have you here this morning with us, and my apologies to interrupt these great conversations that started very early this morning. I was impressed to see so many people here right at the crack of 7:30 for breakfast, so we figured you were very eager to learn a little bit more about the opportunities and challenges of smart energy communities in Canada's north. I'm looking forward to our informative session with our speakers who are exceptionally knowledgeable about the challenges of energy in the remote, rural, and northern communities of Canada. Our interest in the importance of smart energy communities in rural, remote, and northern communities was heightened last year at our international conference in Winnipeg, where we held a special round table on the challenges and opportunities for integrated community energy solutions. This is where we heard about the opportunity and the need for integrated community energy solutions. At the same time, we are introduced to many of you who are here in the room today.
You're here to listen to a remarkable individual that's going to set the stage for us on what's going on and some of the issues in the north. And we have a wonderful panel that is going to be able to comment on some of what they hear and address various questions. The success of today, though, is largely going to be determined by you as an audience. So it's not necessarily the presentations you're going to hear, but it's the questions you're going to ask of these individuals so you can probe deeper and learn what they really think about the issues and how to overcome and seize the opportunities in the north that are represented and of interest to Quest. So without further ado, I believe I'm introducing your keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Couple of little housekeeping things is I'm a really bad follower of a script. So this is a presentation, but I'm probably going to wander, which means that I like to wander too. So if I wander over here and forget that there's a mic over here, you might just have to shoo me back. So it's really nice to see all of you here this morning. I can tell that all the really smart people in the room, at least on the men's side, have realized they don't have to wear a tie. I'm not sure what the rest of you guys are doing with your ties on, but I can also tell that all of those people who don't have a tie on had to have come from the west. So I'm really worried about Storm here, because Storm comes from the west and he's got a damn tie on. So and it's also really nice to see some students from Carleton here as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it is a very important part of the public engagement program, or the public engagement efforts that all of us need to make in terms of our business. And besides that, I'm a Carleton grad, so you know that is also a good thing. So let me start. Now, I realized today I realized after I did the map that this isn't the only part of Canada that's important. There's a little bit of Canada that comes underneath that, about north of 50, that I should have had on here because they're important too. The rest of you, not so much. Okay? Hard to see probably from the back of the room, but if you look at that map and you really look at it in some detail, and I do believe Tanya has some copies of this presentation available for afterwards, you'll see that if you go from west to east, the distances between communities gets bigger. The transmission lines, and there are some on here, get fewer, and the hydro projects get fewer. So when Grant was talking about a Crown corporation that he did some work for called Northern Canada Power Commission, which I also worked for, Northern Canada Power Commission was a federal crown that used to look after all of those plants, all of those communities that are on the map. It was split up a number of years ago and moved to the territorial government. It was called privatizing in the Mulroney era. In other words, get this off my back because it costs money, and give it to the territorial governments who have no money. And since that time, there has been some infrastructure development, but a large majority of those communities are served by diesel. In the south end of the Northwest Territories, there are 2 hydro projects that service some communities, and in the Yukon there are actually 3 hydro plants that service communities. 99% of the energy, and for all of you oil and gas people in this room, energy is electricity, not oil and gas. Okay? 99% of the energy in the Yukon comes that is delivered as delivered energy comes from hydro, and I don't know what the percentage in the Northwest Territories is, but it would be a much smaller percentage. I'm thinking probably in the 60 or 70%. Then, of course, in the Northwest Nunavut, it's 100%. And I'm just trying to set the stage here with this drawing. I don't know how many of you have ever been to these communities, and going to Whitehorse or Yellowknife really doesn't count that much, or Iqaluit, but there's some beautiful places out there, and it's a big part of the country that everybody should, if they can, make an effort to see. We can come back to this in terms of questions, or if anybody has something they want to specifically look at. But let me move to the challenges. So from an electricity point of view, the North is no different from Canada in one respect. It has an aging infrastructure. It needs large amounts of capital to replace that aging infrastructure. I believe the Canadian-wide number is something like $350 billion by 2020. Francis, correct? 2030, sorry. By 2030, just to renew the infrastructure that we have now, to maintain the reliability that we have now, but not to deal with growth, not to deal with change, not to deal with modernization in terms of new technologies. In the North, and most communities, I should say most communities in the South, are also connected by grids. And what I mean by that, because I said grids, is there is an electrical grid that goes, as you all know, is prevalent across the country. Part of it runs east and west in fits and starts, and a big part of it runs north and south, selling power into the U.S. It's a big part of Canada's economy. And the other grid that connects most communities are pipeline grids. And let me tell you that the North, and the northern part of the provinces included, are isolated or islanded systems. No grid connections to anyone else. Not pipeline or electrical grids. Now, within the territories, there are a little bit of grid connections. But that helps serve communities within the territories. That doesn't help when you think about what the most important job that we have as utilities in the North is forecasting what our loads are going to be on a day-in, day-out basis, but more importantly, a year-in and a 3- and 4- and 5-year-in basis. Isolated systems mean that in each of those communities, there is a full backup system of diesel. It's a diesel-based backup in every last one of those places. So in the Yukon, even though we have a hydro-based system, as an example, we have a full diesel backup of the entire system. Because if we lose a hydro plant, or we lose the grid, and it's 30 or 40 below, we treat our customers much, much better than they do in southern Canada. Because when the lights go out here, they don't care how long it takes to get them back on. Because it's generally warmer. We care. We have power outages, just as everybody does, but ours are short, out of necessity. So all we do, which you don't have the luxury of in southern Canada, is, if we lose the grid, we just turn the diesels on in the communities, put the power back on. That's expensive. It's not very environmentally friendly, but it's the cheapest source of backup supply we have. We have really small rate bases. So in other words, we have really small customer bases. And when you start talking about large quantums of capital, that really makes a difference, because just like every other community in Canada, we're regulated. Utilities in this country are regulated. There are a few variations of the form, but generally we're all a rate of return or equity-based regulation. We must recover our costs from our customers. So I have 17,000 customers. Well, I actually probably have about 5 or 6, maybe 800 customers, but one of my customers serves 17,000 people. How do I recover the cost of a $200 million plant expansion on the backs of 17,000 people? More importantly, if I go back to a community, Iqaluit or Cambridge Bay or something out in Nunavut, and try to recover the cost of that expansion on the backs of a few hundred people, it's almost impossible. And it's an important point, and we'll come back to it in a bit. So high fuel costs, higher electricity rates, and I will show you some of those at some point. Rates nowhere in the north reflect the true cost of electricity in many communities. And we'll come to that when we talk about the rates as well. Really volatile demand scenarios. Volatile demand scenarios because if there's economic or industrial growth, it grows and it stops growing. All economies do. They have their ups and downs. They have their ebbs and flows. And I'll use this to kind of give you some context around the problem. We had a mine customer a few years ago that was 40% of our load. You don't have those things in southern Canada. You don't have customers that are that big. You have lots of customers and large loads. So a mine being 40% of the load, and you've got infrastructure to serve that load, which is being paid for by a broad spectrum of the customers, and the mine goes away, stops producing. One of you guys in the south does something to make the copper price go down or something. I don't know. We blame everything on somebody else, So the price of copper, lead, zinc goes down, the mine goes away, and somebody says, well, geez, we got to put the rates up, so everybody else has got to pay for that cost difference that we don't have anymore. Those are almost impossible scenarios, and they happen. And as you would expect, infrastructure development in the north is somewhat higher priced, and it depends on where you are and what you're doing. But it's a higher cost than certainly doing things in the south. And I can attest to that just based on things that we've spent money on the last little while. More importantly, in some ways than many of these other challenges, are the issues dealing with climate change, which are absolutely writ large in front of you in the north. You see them. You can see them firsthand. So trying to deal with, I can say, when I say that, you're going to sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. You can see the impacts of climate change. The question is, what's really causing it and what do you do about it? And that is not an easy solution. I don't think here or in the north, but it's really important. The increasing complexity and cost of regulation makes things more complicated. They take longer. They cost more money. Not saying that's all necessarily bad. It just is a challenge as part of doing projects in the north. And whether it's the same in southern jurisdictions or not, you may think this to be strange, but getting social license to do things in the north is very, very difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. And social license, meaning the acceptability of the communities you're working in, is very, very important if you're going to do things in any community in the north. And hopefully Madeleine Redford will echo that when she talks a little later. So I want to show you this slide, and I want to skip by it a little and come back to it. This is the slide that says you're trying to hit the sweet spot. When we in the Yukon, and this is Yukon based, but I don't see how you do much different anywhere else you go. We've come up with 4 principles: reliability, affordability, flexibility, and environmental responsibility. Now, you can do the diagram some different ways, but what you're trying to do when you're doing development, when you're introducing energy opportunities or integrated community solutions, you're trying to hit a sweet spot somewhere in there. And this really speaks to the social license piece. It speaks to the economics. It speaks to convincing your government masters. We're a Crown corporation. For those of you who might not necessarily be aware, most of the electricity delivered in this country is done so by Crown corporations. So provincial Crown-owned utilities. Provincial governments are in the utility business in a big way. Certainly the biggest, by far the biggest utilities in this country are Crown-owned utilities. So trying to get politicians, your various stakeholder communities, the bankers, because they have a little bit of a say, and everybody into that. And I want to, what we've used here are 4 options as to where they fit. They're somewhat subjective. You could do your own, but the blue piece is hydro. We've got wind, diesel, and LNG. All of those we have on there because we in the Yukon have or will have all of those. We'll talk about the LNG piece in a little while. The opportunities that we look at and we are facing today, and all of the utilities across the north and all of the communities across the north are facing these same issues. New supply options to meet growing demand. So we're a hydro-based system, as I've said, but we have had an absolute, I don't know what kind of a shift, a shift in terms of patterns of people's usage in the Yukon over the last few years. And we have moved from, and again, here you would use gas as your primary source of residential heating. In the north, they use diesel because until recently, or until we get to our LNG piece, nobody has solved for LNG. But people in the Yukon have decided they're going to heat their houses electrically. So everything that's being built and has been built for the last 3 to 4 years is electric heat. Not a very efficient source of using. You're making electricity to use electricity to heat a house is a very inefficient source of the energy usage itself. But people have decided that it's green if it comes from hydro. It's cheaper on the capital side to install, and they have made a blanket assumption that it's cheaper all around. Well, it's only cheaper if oil is expensive enough. It's not always cheaper, but can't talk anybody out of that anymore. As much as we've tried, people have just moved en masse to electric heat. There's lots of new technologies, lots and lots and lots. And you know, along with that, there's lots of experts about those new technologies. And I don't mean real experts, I mean public experts about this is the right new technology for you. We have an opportunity in the Yukon to do some things that will be cross-sectoral in the sense of getting some greenhouse gas reductions down or across the territory when I come back to talking about LNG. And there's two really important pieces on this list. Before I get to the First Nations piece, integrated energy planning and sustainable energy. We've just finished a district energy study as part of doing a number of other things, studies on supply options, starting to get people to think about the integrated solutions is not something that's necessarily been prevalent, you know, certainly in the north. I'm not certain it's prevalent at all in the south in many cases, but getting people to that point is really important. There are communities in the north that used to have district heating systems that don't have them anymore. Inuvik was one. Don't think Iqaluit is working the same way it used to, so that all of that is gone. But they used to use the waste heat from the diesel generators to heat the communities. Gone by the wayside. As part of my duties at the Canadian Electricity Association, where I serve as a board member, I'm also responsible for the Sustainable Electricity Program that the association manages, which is a very important aspect of our association's efforts. It's something we put a lot of effort into, and our members are putting a tremendous amount of effort into sustainable electricity in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental stewardship. Big part of moving forward in the electricity business, we feel, and we certainly feel that in the north. We do not, as a utility, I'm talking about Yukon Energy, we do nothing without First Nations partners. Part of our, built into our fabric, part of the reality of business today in the north, and we do it in an overt way, and we do it in a cooperative way with our First Nation partners. So we have built a couple of large projects over the last number of years, both of which we built with First Nations partners and First Nations investments. And we don't talk about new projects without First Nations partnerships. And we've made lots of mistakes dealing with First Nations. Even though we thought we were doing, you know, being, you know, far-sighted and, you know, and optimistic and taking the initiative, lots and lots of mistakes we've made. But the spirit of what we were trying to do was the right thing to do. So we've learned now that the most important thing is engaging our First Nations communities at the idea stage of a project, not kind of halfway through the project. And that sounds like a simple little lesson to learn. You know, you'd think that after getting all this gray hair, it wouldn't take very long to learn that, but it took us a while. At length, I think I could probably explain why, but we'll save it for that for now. So how do we change the game in the north? How do we change how we look at projects, how we deal with projects, how we think about the big picture? So a year and a bit ago, we were looking at some really high load growth scenarios, scratching our head about what's the right option to put in place to add generation to the system. And everybody goes through this, whether it's a small community in the north or territory. Everybody has to think this through, because when it comes back to it, what's most important here is that when we make choices, we get it right. and we get it absolutely right, there is no room for error in what we do. We are, and I'm being facetious when I say this, we can't afford to be sloppy, like, say, BC Hydro. If they build, 100 megawatts more of new hydro, they just sell it to those Americans. They've got a market. I'm being facetious, but they have a market. And guess what? If their demand is high and their supply is low, well, they just buy some power from Alberta. So that, they're connected a couple of different ways. BC is actually a net importer of power. Bet you everybody in this room thinks they're a big, huge exporter. They got tons of surplus. They have no surplus. They're a net importer. They just manage their power. They sell at night, buy in the morning, get better rates. But they can afford to be, to have a margin. They have some slack. They have a margin. If we build too much, and as I say, the mine goes away, or something happens in the economy and the community shrinks, it's ours. We're paying for it. So we've got to get it right. So as we scratched through this, and as we learned our lessons and took our lumps out in the community, learning how to do things, we came up with a process a year and a half ago, and we called it a charrette. It was, for my money, a big workshop in a big room of people. We spent 3 days. We had 100 people representing the entire community, a whole bunch of people who weren't really keen on what we do, some who weren't really keen on me. That doesn't matter. We brought in experts, independent experts on everything. And so I'll go through the list, and I mean everything. Biomass, solar, wind, coal, diesel, hydro, geothermal, and the dreaded nuclear. We even brought a nuclear guy. So we brought those people in. They talked about what each of their opportunities were, where the costs were, where their technology was applied, how it could be applied, where it might fit, where it wouldn't fit. I don't know if some of you know a fellow by the name of Mark Jacquard. Mark is a professor of, I don't think it's environmental science, but it's environmental management at Simon Fraser. He's a world-renowned expert on energy and energy systems and how they're managed. He was also, at one point in his career, chair of the British Columbia Utilities Commission. And Mark chaired this session that we had 3 days. And as I said to you, yeah, I'm getting told I have to be quiet. Just kidding. As I said to you earlier, when I said we had a broad group of people in the community, that meant students. So we had a group of students from, we have some pretty interesting little education programs, and we have a group called, it's an experiential science class. So these kids, there's about a dozen or so of them, they go to school together, they do experiential science. So they go to science in the real world. They do science in the real world. And they came and spent the 3 days as part of their curriculum. So public participation, Jacquard starts this piece by saying, I'm an environmentalist. I've always been an environmentalist. But I learned something in my career. I used to think that anything that had to do with carbon was bad. What I learned was you have to consider all of the options in every situation. It's not about that solar is good and carbon is bad. It's about the trade-offs and how you manage the systems, the economies, the communities, and the availability of the resources you have in front of you. He's a pretty commanding presence in a room. And he moderated the session for 3 days. So we had speakers in the morning, small groups in the afternoon, and this was what we came up with at the end of 3 days. And one other small piece that's really important when you're talking about planning. I would say this wasn't planning, this was engagement. This had a community talking about these options. And they said we had the GROOM agree on these 4 principles. We would employ these 4 principles as the cornerstone of our planning process. And they said, and we want to continue to be involved. We want, as a community, to continue to participate in the decision-making process. So follow-ups, we had a wind workshop, we had an LNG workshop, we've had a biomass workshop. It's something else. Slips my mind. But we're continuing to have that discussion with the public. We're continuing to try to figure out where we're going. We have this little Ask Janet thing is a little blog our communications manager, Janet Patterson, does. Gets a lot of feedback in the community. We're big news in a small community. Not big news, if you're in a big city, but because there's not much else going on, people like to know what we're doing. So we went through all of this. We've got load scenarios that are, all different levels, all different requirements for new generation. We have 2 problems. Go back to where I started. We've got an aging infrastructure. We have 2 55-year-old hydro plants, a 40-year-old hydro plant, a diesel infrastructure that's really old, and we've got to renew it and replace it. And we were trying to deal with some large loads that may materialize, but in one of those really great things, before we went out and built a whole bunch of generation for new industrial loads, the market said, you can't finance mines, so we're not financing any mines, which means we get a breather because we haven't built anything yet, and we're not going to. What we've done is said, after a whole lot of research and a whole lot of interesting developments, we have decided that liquefied natural gas, or getting gas as a solution to our backup diesel system, is a really important initiative. What it does is it lowers the cost if we ever have to operate those diesels. So think about this for a second. From an operating point of view, a gas engine, a diesel engine, yeah, so what? Same, cost about the same. Doesn't really matter. The fuel cost, so we're going to truck LNG from Calgary to Whitehorse, which is a couple of thousand kilometers, close to 22 or 2,300, and it's going to be just about 50% of the cost of buying diesel fuel. We're going to buy some GE engines from Storm. We've made a commitment. We picked the right engine. We're solving a North American problem on the transportation side because we're going to build 95 cubic meter trucks and permit them. And in North America, they move LNG in 65 cubic meter trucks, but in China and Europe, they use 95. And if you're trucking a long distance, you want to truck as much as you can over that distance to make it economic. And what it's going to do in the Yukon is also introduce a gas source for transportation fuel, which we don't have any access to because we don't have a pipeline. And it's going to introduce a gas source for home heating, which is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts because there's no gas for home heating. And all from trying to solve a simple little problem about how do we most economically ensure that our communities have opportunities to do things differently and to reduce costs and to keep economies to keep economies vibrant. We see ourselves as part of the economic engine, that if we can't keep energy costs affordable, then that really has a big impact on on economies. You unknowingly participate in economic policy if you live primarily in Quebec, Manitoba, and BC, because those electricity rates are kept low for a reason, because it attracts industry. And it's smart, but it's not something that's available for the North. We've got a bunch of things that we have to deal with. You know, we're buying gas in Calgary, but people in Whitehorse are worried about us fracking in Whitehorse, which is part of the social license piece. It's not going to go away. We have partners. We have 2 First Nation partners in our LNG project. We're doing a lot of work to make sure that this is the right decision, but to me, it's the right decision. Solving the LNG conundrum, I guess it is, for the North opens a lot of doors. The other big part of what we do is energy conservation, and I mentioned we've just finished a district heating study, and we can talk about a number of these things later, but I wanted to show you a comparison of electricity bills. And I didn't make this chart up. Most of it probably comes from a study that Quebec Hydro does, but you can see that 1,000 kilowatt hours, which is in many parts of the country about an average monthly consumption, Yukoners pay $136. It's going up because we had a rate increase. Yellowknife is $254. If you're outside of the hydro zone in the Northwest Territories, that same 1,000 kilowatt hours is $491. Iqaluit, I hope I've got it right, $541. Baker Lake, $635. Calgary, $174. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on in Alberta, because this is private. This is the market at work, right? The free enterprise system in the electricity business in Alberta is charging $174.69 for 1,000 kilowatt hours in Calgary, and I'm only charging $154, and that can't happen when you do the economics. So the market is driving the price up. And of course, I can give you the price in Quebec, Manitoba, and BC is all in that $73 range, because they've got big hydro, big legacy assets, and they can keep the prices low. But Toronto, Halifax, you can see them. They're all in that $130 to $140, $50 range. So we do pretty good in the Yukon. We do pretty good in some parts of the Northwest Territories. Nunavut is hard struck because they're small communities, big distances. Trying to find low-cost economic solutions is really difficult to do unless you've got some big input from the feds. We built $200 million worth of new assets over the last 3 years, a new hydro plant, and connected our transmission grid. None of it we would have done without $70 million from the Green Infrastructure Fund and the federal government. Prime Minister decided he liked the idea of hydro in the north, and we got some money. Without that federal money, without provincial money, because nobody is prepared to take a risk. The only people in the north that take risks are the utilities. Trying to build. Trying to get the infrastructure in place, trying to make sure that you do it at the right incremental level, not too much ahead, but trying to keep ahead of development and keep ahead of local growth, because if you don't, then you're playing catch up and everything just costs more. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I am going to be apparently available to answer some other questions, and I thank you very, very much for your time today. Thanks.